Today we are going to discuss the changing perception of a horrendous crime. This is Inverted World Live. What is up, everybody? Thank you for joining us. We're glad you're here. We have a great show today. I am your host, Shane Cashman. I am joined by Alex. How are you?
Hey, how's it going? What's up?
You know, I've been astral projecting out of my body by accident. I'm trying to figure out how to keep my brain inside of my human husk.
The joys of having children and also doing this show at the same time.
Yeah. Every time I open a door, I'm in a new dimension. But it's fun. I think we're in the same dimension we were last time we were in this room.
Yeah.
It feels slightly different, but
is it the walls coming in on us a little bit every time?
I think people are hired to come in at night and move the walls.
Yeah.
So like every day it's just a little smaller until it's finally a coffin for me.
where you love to be.
Yes, my favorite place. So I'm excited to have our guest today. She's a great friend, and we're going to talk about the Menendez case, something that I honestly don't know too much about. I remember how it affected the way I viewed the case as a kid and all the jokes that were made about it in like late night TV and how it became a cliche like a lot of these major crimes. But there's been a lot of news that came out recently. A lot of you probably watched. I believe it's called Monster. That has a lot of people talking about the way we're changing, the way we're looking at it. And now they might even be released. So Kurtz,
I haven't actually watched it.
You haven't?
No, because I don't think I can handle it anymore.
I know.
Can't handle that kind of crime.
When it comes to the kids and stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
And what I've been looking into it, it's really hard to stomach.
Yeah.
And it already, from the little bit I know, has changed the way I've viewed it.
Yeah. And I have two sons, so.
Yeah. It's crazy because it was a joke, after these horrible things happen, like when the O.J. Simpson or even the lady who spilled McDonald's coffee on her, obviously very different case, but they become like this punchline.
Yeah.
That's how a lot of people remember these certain crimes as a kid because they wind up at like Jay Leno making a reference about it. And then it just kind of goes away and you think you believe in the caricature of the crime.
Yeah.
And, you hear the Menendez brothers and always they would make jokes about parents and all this stuff. I didn't know anything about how evil the parents were.
Yeah, I don't really know too much, so I'm excited
let's bring on the great Colonel Kurtz. And she is great. We've done a lot of shows together. Very happy to have you today. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's great to be here. And I've been getting over some allergies. So I'm sorry if I sound a little nasally, but I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah.
I love your show.
Thank you.
I've caught a number of episodes of it. And so, congratulations.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. I'm stoked to have you. We typically talk about a lot of pop culture stuff. And I feel like this is a segue from pop culture into the true crime situations because of how this case infected pop culture and largely forgotten, I think. So there's all this new talk about the Menendez case. I guess we start at the beginning. If you could walk us through like who they were and what went down.
Yeah, so I love the way you were talking about the perception of this case and these guys in the 90s, because I was really interested in the 90s in this case. Even as a precocious child, I was really into news and true crime. You can probably relate to some of this.
Yep.
And I remember, like you, that it was widely assumed in the media, certainly late night television, really among almost everyone, that these were a couple of spoiled, bratty rich kids who had been given everything in life, and they had repaid their parents for that generosity and love by blowing them to smithereens.
Right.
And so what happened was when the trial began and their attorneys helped them to bring out this sexual abuse defense, it was not taken seriously. It was widely seen as a legal concoction to try to get them off the hook. And so when that first trial ended in a hung jury, and it was discovered, it came out that the jury hung because of all the women on the jury. In fact, there was a gender split. The men thought the abuse defense was ridiculous, and the women felt really bad and empathetic for these guys.
Right.
So there was a hung jury. The men basically one way, the women the other. And the jury was widely lampooned at the time and derided for being so stupid as to believe this half-baked sexual abuse story.
Wow.
And so then what happened was there was a second trial, and the second trial was presided over by the same judge, which I'm not an expert on the justice system, but doesn't that seem crazy to you?
Yeah. Totally crazy.
And so what happened was the judge, he had been also so lampooned and derided in the popular culture and the media for letting the first trial turn into a freak show, a circus, that he decided he was going to just basically not allow the sexual abuse defense or narrative more or less into the second trial.
Wow.
And so what happened is basically the jurors were put in a position where they couldn't go the manslaughter route. And so they had to basically find these guys guilty of murder, capital murder, and they almost got the death penalty, just narrowly escaped that.
Wow.
So the story went away for a long time. And I didn't give it any thought. I assumed that they got what they deserved. But then I'd say about in 2017 or 2018, I happened to catch a documentary, an A&E documentary titled Eric Menendez Tells All. And it was a multi-part documentary and interview, not only with Eric Menendez, the younger Menendez brother, but also people who had known and worked with Jose Menendez, their father, and even relatives, even the sister of Kitty Menendez, his wife, one of the victims. And I was shocked to find out that there was actually a great deal of evidence, testimony, and really strong indications that, in fact, these guys had been terribly abused by their father, and also to a degree by their mother, who I think had borderline personality disorder and herself was full of terrors, frankly. And so, and I guess that in the first go around in the 90s, because I was a kid, I didn't really understand the gravity of the sexual abuse being described in the first trial. And so this time in 2017, when I saw this documentary, it really brought it home for me, because I thought to myself, my God, this is the worst kind of abuse. We're not even talking in this about allegations of inappropriate touching, which that's not good either, right? That's a molestation and assault. We're talking about the repeated sodomy of children and torture, and really just unbelievable sustained torture in that house.
It was, I mean, the story is crazy, and we can get into the details just so people, it's worth knowing just how evil this father was, according to the kids. But
where was the mother?
Let me say one more thing,
Shane,
Shane,
go for it.
Because we're going to get into these stories about the dad and the family, and I want people to understand. We're not just going by what these two guys have claimed, because as you know, I have a YouTube channel where I devote a significant amount of time to debunking false Me Too claims, or what I believe are false Me Too claims. And so I cover the Johnny Depp case, cover Marilyn Manson, other things. And so I am not one to believe all accusers. Right. But it is astounding the number of people that have come out and said that Jose Menendez was possibly the worst human being they'd ever met in their life. In fact, in this documentary that I was telling you about, this A&E documentary, they interview some of his coworkers. They interview members of his own family, and they all say that he was a horrific, sadistic, terrifying human being. And in fact, the prosecution in these trials could not. They tried to find a witness to counteract the Menendez brothers' defense, and they tried to find a character witness for Jose Menendez, and they could not find one person to testify in favor of his character. Not one.
Wow.
So, and also there's other corroborating evidence besides testimony. There is a letter that has come to light that was written by Eric Menendez 6 months before the murders. It has been verified. The DA, the LA DA accepts it. Everybody pretty much accepts it at face value. And he's talking about how the abuse has started again. He says, he even gets into, he says, I can't bear to see my dad's fat body. He's so gross and overweight. And he's talking about the abuse and how he doesn't know what to do, and his father's crazy and he's terrified. So I want people to understand that there is corroborating evidence. And there's also a former member of the boy band Menudo, Roy Rossello, who has come out and has said that when Jose Menendez was managing his band for RCA, because he was the president of RCA Records at that time, and Menudo was one of his main projects, that he was drugged and raped by Jose Menendez, and that he was in terrible pain, physical pain, for weeks after. So just to go from there, I want people to understand these are very credible allegations.
Yeah. And I think there was also photos, right, of the kids that the father took, naked photos. Yeah, it was horrible stuff. And all this stuff I knew nothing about. You only hear about the murder, and, it was a ghastly murder. but you don't know anything leading up to it. The thing that I also found fascinating is that I knew nothing about the Menendez father being a celebrity of sorts. I didn't know these people had any power, putting that in quotes for people just listening. Like they were in the Hollywood world. I didn't know this was even in Beverly Hills. And when it happened, I was pretty young, but like you would have thought at least you would have an inkling to be like, these were, the elite class to some degree. I mean, like you said, he was with the Menudo, and it wasn't even until I heard that he had a connection to the Menudo band. I'm like, when I first heard it, I'm like, how? How does this father have any connection to the music world? And then I looked at him like, oh my goodness, he was up in the upper echelon of this world at all. What do you make of that? Because it's interesting that we're hearing this new perception now, and it's really caught on while the stuff like the Diddy stuff is going on, And there's a lot of weird similarities. Because I heard that the father, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but someone said the Menendez father, gave him like a drink of wine, and the wine screwed them up.
That's Roy Rossello. That's the Menudo guy.
Oh, that's the Menudo guy, which is odd. It sounds a lot like the accusations they're saying about we're going on at the Diddy parties.
Right. It's, I don't claim to be as well versed in the Diddy situation. So, but I can just say in sort of a pop culture sense, in the way that the things that are becoming interesting to our society and our culture right now, there does seem to be very much of a strong interest on the dark side of the entertainment industry. And this idea that underneath the veneer of like the cool parties and the fun, fast lifestyle, that in fact, there are these dark things sort of, slithering around, kind of like, the title of our program here, Inverted World, that there is this dark side. And people have always known this. I mean, you can go back and read stories, from the early days of the film industry.
Oh, yeah.
Horrible things were happening. But I will say this also about Jose Menendez. So he apparently was a man of incredible drive and determination, and extremely successful in business. He had once been the president of Hertz. In fact, he hired O.J. Simpson to do those famous Hertz commercials.
No.
And when the Menendez brothers were being held in the LA County Jail awaiting their trial, they actually spoke with and hung out with O.J. Simpson a bit and helped to convince him to drop Robert Shapiro as his attorney, by the way, because they had Robert Shapiro as their attorney and they'd not had a good experience. But anyway, I digress.
That's crazy.
But the point is, Jose Menendez, he had achieved a great deal. And yes, he was very entrenched in the entertainment industry. And so when he was killed, he and Kitty, his wife, were killed, there were a lot of people who just did not believe that someone could be that successful and be a child rapist. And I think that is where we see the positive aspect of Me Too, or the positive aspect of a different awareness of sexual abuse and victimization that we have now as a culture, in that people now understand that yes, you can be the president of RCA and you can be hanging out with celebrities and you can be extremely successful and live in Beverly Hills, and you can also be sodomizing your children. Right.
It's like everyone was so accepting of the Catholic Church, of like the accusations and how widespread that abuse was. Another thing that became a punchline, which is always weird to me. Like, I think it's we can joke about anything, but once the society just understands the punchline, they forget about how grisly a lot of the stuff behind it is, like everything we've been talking about. But if our society can accept that the Catholic Church had so much abuse going on, why has it been so hard for everyone to accept that it's going on in Hollywood? Maybe it's because people look up to it more, or they have, these idols, I'm putting in quotes, that are in Hollywood. But it's clearly, what was the young girl's name from Wizard of Oz? Judy Garland, right?
Yes.
Like, she had a horrible experience.
So many of those early stars, if you read, Marilyn Monroe, if you read their biographies and you read about the things that men in that time were allowed to get away with, that make, Harvey Weinstein stories pale in comparison, actually. So there's always been this dark, seamy side to the entertainment industry. And so I think that really, in the early 90s, I think people were not prepared to take the abuse of males seriously, sexual abuse. And also, these were strong, healthy-looking men when they were arrested. When they killed their parents, they were technically, legally grown men.
Right.
And so people see these really, strong, healthy-looking, good-looking, virile-appearing men, and they say, how could one of these guys be bending over for his dad to rape him, regularly? Like, it just doesn't make sense. Or people would say, you don't have to kill your parents. You just leave. You just run away. Right. And to that, I would say that when someone has been abused on the level that these guys were abused, and when they've grown up in talk about an inverted world, such a crazy, crazy environment, then their thinking is going to get crazy. So I don't know what was in the head of the Menendez brothers when they killed their parents. What I would imagine is it was a mix of a lot of things. It was a mix of genuine fear. It was a mix of anger. It was a mix of, and then also personal self-interest. And I'm sure, and I do think that to an extent, the financial interest came into it, in that they could not imagine a life apart from the safety, the cocoon of safety, financial safety, security, I should say, that their parents had given them, and their parents had instilled in them that nothing else mattered as much as success and financial security. So I'm just not sure that these guys were capable, in the state that they were in, and after the abuse that they'd suffered, of just as very young adults just walking away. Right.
I also think they're so far removed from reality, because on one sense, no offense to some friends of mine in Beverly Hills, but you are detached from reality when you're in that world. It's not this world. And then to add on top of that, the horrible suffering of abuse that they went through, that they're saying went through since childhood. Because they say it started young, right? It wasn't like...
Right, 6 years old.
Right. So that right there just shatters anyone's sense of reality. And I think it's very hard to even try to imagine logic as we might think of it, and what they're dealing with in that world within the cocoon of Beverly Hills.
Right.
So it's really crazy.
Absolutely it is. And, there is so much that we don't even have time to discuss in terms of the abuse that they went through, even outside of the horrendous sexual stuff. I mean, one of Jose Menendez's relatives, someone who should have been inclined to defend him, testified that he saw Jose punch one of his children in the face when they were 5 years old with a closed fist, just punch him in the face. Now, this is one of Jose's relatives. Wow. There were people, and he killed a couple of their beloved pets. He killed a dog. He beat a bunny rabbit to death that Lyle brought home. Lyle brought home this bunny that he had gotten from school, I don't know, class or something. And he was in love with his bunny. And his mom said, "Get rid of it." Dad said, "Get rid of it." He took a little too long to get rid of it. So one of the parents, I think Jose, beat the thing to death, and Lyle found it beaten to death in the trash. So we're talking again about an incredibly sadistic man and an incredibly troubled woman attached to him who had a whole range of issues of her own. And then together they just became this monster. They are the monster. Yeah. And these kids grew up in an incredibly insane, traumatizing environment.
It's hard for people to realize that these monsters are everywhere. I mean, from all the reading we've done on this show, we talked about, and things I've written about, there are monsters that are just working at the gas station. There's monsters in every level, everywhere. They're hiding. They're obviously in positions of power. They're in schools, and you have to be aware of that. But when you're talking about this type of the Jose Menendez character, it almost reminds me of a Ted Bundy. Even though he wasn't really a serial killer, Ted Bundy had power. He was hiding in plain sight, had a wife, and was satisfying these evil urges in the shadows for a long time. And I think, the thing we hear so much when these types of stories break, especially when it comes to like serial killers or serial rapists and these just evil degenerates, oh, he was such a nice neighbor. I'm so shocked. So shocked.
Well, it's funny, and yes, you're right about that. What's funny though in the Menendez case is that they couldn't even find someone to say he's a nice neighbor. Right. But seriously, I mean, it's funny in some of the documentaries I've seen, there are guys who worked with him, fellow executives, and they said that when they found out he had been shot, they weren't surprised. They said he was one of the top 5 meanest people, most horrible people they'd ever met. I mean, just everyone. Wow. And there were relatives also of the Menendez brothers, cousins, who lived with the family at various times, and they testified to horrible things. One of them said that one night Lyle Menendez, when he was a child, he came into her room and asked if he could sleep with her because his dad was coming into his room and touching his genitals. Jeez. Well, she's obviously very alarmed. She was a teenager at that time. Right. So she goes and she gets Kitty, the wife and the mother, and tells her about this. And Kitty's response, without a word, is to take the kid back upstairs, shut the door, never mention it again. There were other instances where a cousin who lived with them testified that Jose Menendez would take his kids into his room, close the door, and they would hear weird sounds and screaming. And they would go to try to, investigate, help. And Kitty would scream, "Don't go down there. Don't go down there," because she knew what was going on. Right. So this is an incredibly sick structure where the mother is not only looking the other way, but seems to be facilitating in some way or abetting this.
Was there evidence that she was being abused by him?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, she was in hell, and she was heavily self-medicating, and she was an alcoholic. So, I have no problem believing that to a certain extent, her failures were results of the abuse that she was enduring. But she also had her own issues, and she would go into rages, which clench her fist. She would lock her kids in the closet for sometimes days at a time. They would have to defecate in the closet.
Oh man!
I mean, we're just talking like crazy people.
Wow, wow. Is there anything known about Jose's history? You know, like was he a victim of abuse at some point or anything like that we know of?
So it's interesting that the Ryan Murphy series does speculate about that, or it includes a plot line where Jose confronts his own mother about her molesting him. And I don't know that that is actually based on any kind of testimony or anything, because I have not yet found that outside of that show. So I don't know if that's speculative or not. But, you know, I just believe that most people who are victimizers are playing out their own victimization. And so I would not be surprised to find that he had been molested or abused. But then again, you know, who knows? Some people, I think, just have a screw loose in the head, or have their sexual wiring is just off, or they don't have an empathy capacity, right? Yeah. And so I don't know, but it wouldn't surprise me. Now, his family, he was from Cuba, and his family, they were very wealthy during the Bautista reign. And then when the communists took over and Bautista fell, they became refugees, like a lot of wealthy Cubans, right? Because, you know, when communism comes in, the wealthy classes are in deep shit. Yeah. And so the family fled to the United States. And so Jose actually started off as a dishwasher. Came from a very wealthy, esteemed Cuban family, but was basically nothing over here in the U.S., started out as a dishwasher, worked his way up. And so he was an incredibly accomplished, hardworking, driven man, which is wonderful, except, unfortunately, the flip side of that, it seems, is that he was a monstrous human being.
Right. And so what we know now. So it's crazy to me that the abuse thing just was erased from the trial, right? And I think the second trial
it pretty much was, yeah.
And I forget if it was during the first or second one when this phrase started being used called the abuse excuse. So that was a way to, go on if you know about that.
No, I was just going to say what was also working against the Menendez brothers is that their attorney, Eric's attorney, Leslie Abramson, she had developed a reputation for getting clients off using the abuse excuse. In fact, one of her previous clients that she had just gotten off, or maybe gotten a light sentence for, she had used the sexual abuse defense. And so unfortunately, that also set a lot of people up to think that what the Menendez brothers were attesting to was just a recycling of a tried and true strategy that Leslie Abramson had been using. And so in a way, even though she was a great attorney, that sort of discredited in the public's eye the claims by the Menendez brothers.
Right. And then the way they acted after they murdered their parents was also used against them. And that's something that I do remember hearing about a lot. You know, that was
like spending money and
like what did they do after? They went kind of crazy, right, with the money?
Well, it's interesting. There is that is a little more nuanced as well when you actually look into it. One of the brothers, Lyle, did splash out on some items, Rolexes and things like that. But Eric actually did not spend nearly as much as people would think that he did. And considering the price of the items they were buying, they actually didn't run through that much money. I mean, if you buy a Rolex and a Porsche, you know, those are two items, but they'll clean you out, right? That's a lot of money. And so when people hear, oh, they were spending all this money, it wasn't really like they were going on crazy sprees. They did buy some items. But, you know, what they have claimed is that they were raised by their mother to see spending money as therapeutic. That was their mother's therapy, they said, because she was very wealthy and she was miserable. And so in addition to alcohol and pills, she was kind of a shopping addict. She loved to shop. She would take the boys shopping. That was their therapy. And so one of the things that they pointed out in this documentary that I was watching is that while it might be perceived as monstrous behavior by people, they were spiraling. They were psychologically just completely spiraling, didn't know what to do with themselves, didn't know how to deal with their feelings they were having, the position they were in. They now no longer had any structure to their lives because the people who'd given it structure, even if it was bad, were taken away. And so they were just kind of like grasping at whatever basically would make them feel better. So I understand that people from the outside, they see these rich Beverly Hills kids, they've just killed their parents, and now they're buying Rolexes or Porsches or whatever. But I just think that if you see it as a coping mechanism, or two people who've just done something crazy and they don't know what to do, they're spiraling, it makes a little more sense.
Oh yeah, I know people who have been grief-stricken, who are poor, and still have their coping mechanism be like attached to materialism, and they need to purchase anything, Amazon, whatever, just because it's anchoring them to the reality they need to, before they get washed away in the grief. So I do understand that. And then wasn't one of them also like playing tennis in Israel or something?
Yeah. So one of the things that Jose Menendez had really driven his kids very hard about was excelling in sports, because the Menendez family had one of its members, I think a sister or maybe an aunt of Jose Menendez, was an Olympic swimmer, and athletic prowess was really big in their family. And then Jose was really a big person on that too, right? Toughness, virility, masculinity. And so he would put his children through these grueling tutoring sessions for tennis and things like that, where it was basically hours and hours of relentless coaching while Jose would just berate them for hours. Jeez. It was joyless. It was horrible. In fact, Eric's tennis coach testified at the trial about how awful Jose was and how he ended up getting fired because he stood up to Jose and said, you can't treat your kids this way, right? Wow. But yes, Eric was in Israel at a tennis tournament, and when he found out that Lyle had been arrested and that he was wanted, he willingly got on a plane and came here.
Oh wow! Do you ever watch Twin Peaks?
A long time ago. I'm not conversant on it, but yeah, I mean, well enough.
It's just I bring it up on this show quite a bit, and I think the Menendez case reminds me of it because there's a character, there's a father. So sorry, spoiler alerts, people who haven't seen this 30-year-old show yet, but it's my favorite show. It's my favorite show besides The Leftovers. And there's a character, there's a father who we find out is a horrible man, but you find out way later on. And he's a man of, he's an esteemed person in the community. His wife, we find out, has been drugged and or drugging herself to stay quiet and complacent. And when I hear these stories, like with Jose and so many other stories out of California in particular, it just seems like David Lynch must have seen something out there or just understood the culture of Hollywood, because it seems like such a metaphor for so much that happens out there. I really recommend that show because it speaks so much to this evil stuff.
It actually made me think of the movie Iron Claw. Did you ever see that? It's a newer movie.
Yes.
I mean, and that takes place in Texas, but it's the same thing. The father is, he's a wrestler, but he's very persistent with his children and forces them into sports. And like, he's kind of verbally abusive. You don't see any physical abuse, but like, it's kind of insane. And that family goes through torture itself. And the mother doesn't do anything. She just is complicit. She doesn't, doesn't stand up for her children. And I don't know, it's worth watching.
But honestly, it might also not be just a metaphor for Hollywood, even though it's depraved out there. But this is something that's not just in Hollywood. We were saying earlier with the monsters, it is everywhere. And I don't know if
it could also just be generational too.
For sure, generational. You don't know what happened, beyond that. And it makes me think of the story of there's a family that had all their kids, had a lot of kids, and they were just held captive in the basement their entire lives. Have you seen this story?
I know what you're talking about.
And the mom, was just powerless and did nothing, for various reasons. I don't really know why, but again, they're in a totally detached reality. The father was working for Lockheed Martin, which I always thought was weird, but the one of them eventually got out, and those kids were saved. The horrible thing about that story is that those kids were saved and then put into foster care, and they were abused in the system. It's disgusting. Okay.
Can I say something about the mom too?
Yeah,
please.
Quickly?
Because a great deal of ire has been directed at the Menendez brothers for the fact that they also killed the mother,
right? And
that they went back actually and reloaded. She wasn't dead yet. I know this is gruesome, but she wasn't dead yet, and so they went back and reloaded and finished her off. And I just want to say several things. They have stated that their mother, for years and years, seemed so miserable and talked about suicide constantly that they really believed that they were committing a kind of euthanasia of her.
Right.
And that may sound unbelievable to people, but I can just tell you from my own personal experience, I did not have a father like Jose Menendez, and thank God I was never sexually abused. But he was in a number of ways extremely sadistic and psychologically abusive. And my mother, she did not leave him until we were in college. She has a great deal of guilt about that. She feels now she should have gotten us out a lot earlier. But as I've become an adult myself, I see how complicated life is with a family and with, my mom, she did not have a job. She was more or less a stay-at-home mom. She was completely financially tied to my father. Also, there was an entire social matrix that they were a part of that she felt was also good for us. And she felt like if there were a divorce, that would tear our lives apart. And so there were all of these considerations that at the time she felt like she was just doing the best she could. And I think that and so I think that in the case with so where I was going with that, is that my mother, when she was going through this period, she was extremely depressed. And I had the feeling often, it would occur to me at times growing up, I wish that she would die. She's so miserable. Not that I wanted her to die for my own reasons, but that I just could see how miserable she was. And I would think pretty regularly, God, please take her out of this misery. So when I see like with the Menendez brothers, I actually do think that it's not unlikely that they felt like they really weren't doing something horrible for her. They felt like she probably couldn't survive without the father, that she was miserable, et cetera. And so I don't know. I think people need to understand that, again, in sort of a crazy way, there's a kind of logic to this. And the fact also that they went out and reloaded, I mean, this might sound crass to people, but once you've shot someone up, they're going to be screwed for the rest of their lives. And so I figure at that point, like the humane thing is to finish someone off. That might seem like nuts to people, but like the fact that they shot their mom and that she wasn't quite dead and they went back and they finished her off. Like, to me, that's just kind of like, okay, that doesn't seem that crazy to me either.
So I want to talk about the crime more, but I want to say I have a hard time with the murder still, despite knowing what happened. Like, I go back and forth on this idea of, because I don't even agree with capital punishment. I would prefer to see these people just put away forever and rot. I don't agree with murder. Even though I struggle with this when it comes to the abuse of kids, because like I wrote this story about, we went and captured some pedophiles in Ohio about a year ago, and that was all I saw was red in my brain. I just like, these people need to be taken care of. But morally, I have a very hard time with even accepting the idea of murder, and I'd want to put them away, remove them from society. But I can't, put myself obviously in the Menendez brothers' shoes because of the years of horrible abuse they went through, and it's hard to stomach even hearing, them taking their mother's life. I heard the case that they made for her being so depressed and suicidal. I think they even maybe found a letter from her, right?
She would leave them letters frequently because she wanted them to know how miserable she was, and she was always telling them. She would threaten to poison the family too and stuff like that. But yes,
wow.
But let me just say also, Shane, I don't think anyone, not me, and certainly not the Menendez brothers, claims that this was a justified act, in the sense, or not justified. I don't think anyone thinks that this is something that society should condone, or that this was a good way for them to deal with things. And, people should look into this and should listen to what the Menendez brothers have been saying for years, that they really regret it. And Eric regretted it so much that he ended up having to go and squeal to his shrink, who ended up getting them turned in, because he was so guilt-ridden about it. Lyle also, a lot of people don't know this, Lyle wrote a letter to Eric in prison, and it was supposed to be in jail when they were awaiting trial, and it was supposed to be just between them. But the guards ended up finding it during a search, and Lyle had just assumed that Eric would destroy it because he would send him these letters and then he would write, "Please destroy," after reading. So it was just for Eric. No one else was supposed to see it, right? But in the letter, Lyle talks about how he is reluctant to expose the family secrets because he feels so bad about ruining their parents' reputation.
Wow.
And so there was a lot of reluctance. People don't understand this. There was a great deal of reluctance initially on the part of the Menendez brothers to use this defense, even though they had experienced these things, because they actually felt a great deal of allegiance to their father and mother still, even though they killed them.
Right.
And so I just want people to understand that there's been a great deal of regret expressed by the Menendez brothers, and that no one is saying that this is the proper way to handle a situation like this. I think
Right.
that what most of us are saying, though, is that this seems like a very clear manslaughter case that should not have gotten these guys a life sentence in prison.
Right.
And so they have served 35 years. And so for the people who say we can't condone vigilante justice, well, they've served 35 years.
Right.
The better part of their lives, their youth at least, is over.
And if it is manslaughter, that's well beyond what you would serve in the state of California, right?
Right.
Man, it's crazy. When I first heard that this was happening, like, and I only really learned about this whole new perception of the case very recently. And when you and I talked about it like a week ago, my initial instinct before I knew anything was I'm skeptical because of what happened after the big, viral story of Serial. Remember Serial? The podcast. I was like, real big podcast. I loved it.
The girl was missing, or
there was 2 different serials. I think, there was a murder, and they were trying to redefine the guy who was convicted of the murder, Adnan Syed, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And it turns out that maybe might not be the case now. And I think he actually might be guilty. I haven't really been following it closely, but I remember there was one perception, then there was a whole new perception because of a podcast, and then he got, I think, a retrial or something. And then it's back to the initial, oh no, he's bad. And then I'm applying that, wrongfully to this case. But the more you look into this, it's like, oh no, there might actually be something here where it's not, what they were convicted for, and it might be manslaughter. But then, okay, so going back to the crime, do we know why it happened that day? What led to that being the day after so long of enduring the abuse? Do we know why they chose to do it that day?
Well, the Menendez brothers claim, of course, we don't know, right? But the Menendez brothers claim that it happened because the sexual abuse had finally broken out into the open in their family, in the sense that it was something that Lyle, the older brother, found out that the younger brother was still being molested or raped by the father. He thought that it had ended.
Wow.
So when he found that out, he freaks out. He confronts the dad. The dad tells him, he says, basically, F off. I can do whatever I want with my son. Lyle goes to the mom, and Lyle and Eric, and she basically says, yeah, I knew. What of it? And so he claims, the Menendez brothers claim that they got really freaked out because they realized at this point that everything now was sort of exposed, and that their parents might feel vulnerable now with this thing having broken out into the open. Their parents might feel like they were in a vulnerable position, and they might want to off their children, basically.
Wow.
And another consideration was that Jose Menendez recently had expressed to his children that he was basically sort of done with them because they had been such disappointments, and he was sort of going to move on with his life and his own dreams and plans, instead of really facilitating theirs anymore. And so they had this feeling that their father had basically washed their hands of them, and that therefore now they were kind of a liability, and that their parents, they claimed that they really felt in their crazy state that their parents could kill them.
Right.
And they said that they were terrified of their parents. And so that's what they claim. Now, the prosecution would claim that there were these other incentives, talking about financial stuff, a fear that they would be written out of the will, and these things. And I don't think that we'll ever really know. My guess is that it was probably a mixture of all of these different considerations and fears and incentives. But again, we're dealing with a crazy situation. And what I keep coming back to in this is that whatever monstrous behavior the brothers were guilty of, certainly the murders, gruesome, horrific, monstrous, and some of this other behavior, it was a direct result of what the victims did to them.
Right.
So I just don't see how we get away here from a certain reciprocal responsibility in this, which no, it doesn't completely justify the murders, but I do think it puts them in a different light, so that, again, we need to be more lenient on these guys, especially since, again, they've served a long sentence.
Yeah, and I believe in redemption, even something as ghastly as murder. And also, if you want to believe their side of the story in terms of they felt like the walls were closing in as a liability, if they've experienced years of like horrible abuse, it's not that far beyond the realm of possibility for the think that they'd be murdered after.
Well, and
everything
he had threatened to kill them many times. I mean,
Right.
both of the parents had. And again, the threat of murder had been hanging over them since they were children, because Eric testified. Again, this is if we believe it, but Eric testified that when he was a child, at a certain point, he refused or tried to stand up to his father and say, "I don't want to do this anymore," the sexual stuff, right? And the dad went. He claims that the dad went and got a big knife and came back into the room and held the knife against his throat. And he said, "If you don't do what I want, I'm going to kill you." So if that is true,
Right.
and again, there's corroborating evidence, testimony that this was a bad man doing bad stuff. If that's true, then I can't imagine growing up in that environment and not being terrified of your
Right.
parents.
What do we know about their lives in prison? Have they been?
Apparently they've been model prisoners, model citizens. And
Didn't one get married?
Oh, really?
they both
Oh.
did. In fact, Lyle got
Wow.
married, then divorced, then married to someone else. So he's
Wow.
had 2 prison wives. But no,
That's
they
a good
did,
name for
and
a podcast.
They've been
Prison
model
wives.
prisoners,
Yeah.
and they haven't received any marks against them. I think Eric received a mark for having some kind of contraband or something like that. But in fact, Lyle had to be moved to a special section of the prison because he refused to stand up for himself in fights. He would just take it. He would just take getting beaten. And so he's extremely nonviolent. But people who have spent time in prison with these guys, in fact, you talked to Michael Franzese on Tim's show,
Yep. Yeah.
the mafia guy.
Yeah.
He spent time with the Menendez brothers in prison. He believes that they need to be released. And
Oh, wow.
so really everyone who has spent time with these guys or hung out with them thinks that they are great people now.
It seems to be that way. You know, the public perception has certainly changed. If you look at any video right now about it, I was expecting to see a split, you know, because it seems like it's kind of veering into political realm because of Newsom saying basically he's going to commute the sentence. And anytime Newsom says anything, you know, the right is like, well, it's got to be wrong.
Right.
And I get it because I really don't like that guy. However, you know, it's worth looking into this case. And, you know, I look at all the comments and it's overwhelming positive. They got to be let out. You know, I do always get a little squeamish after it's based on a podcast or a show because I feel like so much is trying to warp your perception to whatever narrative they want you to sell. That said, like you said earlier, there is a lot of stuff out there that corroborates the brothers' stories, and it does add up that there's something way more than what we were initially told. So we'll see. You know, if they get let out, that would be. So what's next? Is it because it come down to the governor, or is there something else?
So they've got a couple of possible avenues here. LADA George Gascon. Of course, we were talking about the politics, the political aspect earlier. You know that I'm no fan of Gascon for the way that he's handled other cases and situations. But LADA Gascon is very much in their corner, and he has asked for a resentencing. So they're going to go before a judge December 10th, I believe, and that judge will decide on their fate. Now, there is some fear that when the new DA comes in, because Gascon is way behind in the polls and he's probably going to lose. So the new DA has voiced some concern over the recent shifts in Menendez policy. And so there is some concern that the new DA, when he comes in, he might revoke the resentencing request. But the DA has also, as you mentioned, petitioned the Governor Newsom, for clemency. And so those are 2 avenues by which they could hopefully, you know, those of us who want them to come home, hopefully be home by the holidays.
Wow, that'd be crazy.
But all of this is still tenuous, right? You know, I can't imagine being in the position of the Menendez brothers and half of you is so hopeful and like, this is it, we're going to get out. But then half of you is also saying, no, come on, keep your expectations down. Anything could happen. And I think that's really the situation. Anything could happen.
And forgive me if you said this already and I forgot, but are they in life? Do they have life in prison? Is that what they're up against? Or is
Yes, it's life.
Wow.
And they are not eligible for parole. So it was life without parole. They barely escaped the death penalty, which at that time was the electric chair. Is that right?
I'm not sure what it would have been.
But they're in the same prison.
They are now?
They are now. They were separated for like 20 years, though.
Oh.
Wow. That is crazy. Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens. And if they let out, I mean, that's going to be a crazy shift.
Circus.
Yeah. Yeah. Who's going to get that interview? You know, they're going to end up on ABC, and that's going to be wild. That's how it goes down. Well, that'll be interesting to look forward to see what's going on with that. I imagine we'll probably know soon. It seems, if it's
Yeah.
by Thanksgiving time, that should be soon. So also in terms of changing perception, and also I think you mentioned Francis. I think he was with this next person I want to talk about, the son of Sam. There's all new theories about him, and you mentioned something about was son of Sam. Where are you with that whole story? Because it seems to be all over the place lately.
Yeah, so basically, I'm going to be referencing in this the Netflix multi-part documentary Sons of Sam and the research behind that. And some of this is more, I'll just say this is more controversial than the Menendez brothers. So, there's wide varying opinion about what I'm about to get into. But this is sort of the way that this theory has emerged. So originally, when these murders took place, and by the way, people who don't know, remember, we're talking about 1970s New York. There were these random shootings that basically terrified the city. They called it Summer of Sam, in fact, because it seemed to be just totally random shootings of people in their cars, often like younger people making out, stuff like that, right? And the perpetrator or perpetrators of this started sending letters taunting the cops and the media. And they made references to, we are the sons of Sam, et cetera, right? So long story short, finally, someone is arrested. His name is David Berkowitz. He was a postal worker. They arrested him. They found him because he had gotten a parking ticket at the same time that he had stopped somewhere to murder some people. And so they were able to basically trace him through this parking ticket and arrested him. And he took full responsibility publicly. He took responsibility, claimed insanity, right? But took responsibility for the murders. And so it was assumed to be like case closed. But there was this one reporter named Maury Terry, and Maury Terry he's dead now. He is very controversial, and I do think he went too far at times with this thing that would turn into an obsession for him. But I do think he was onto something. Maury Terry found evidence that, in fact, these murders were not just the sole doing of Berkowitz, but in fact, Berkowitz was a member of an underground cult in New York, and it was a satanic cult, and that this cult was carrying out these murders together. So in other words, there'd be different perpetrators. And the evidence that Maury Terry had for that is that David Berkowitz lived next to a man named Sam who had a dog. And so it was then widely claimed that the barking dog, had driven Berkowitz crazy, and Berkowitz even said something to that effect, that the dog told him to commit murders and so forth, right? And so a lot of people know about this. Oh, his neighbor was Sam, and Sam had a dog. What a lot of people don't know, though, and Maury Terry uncovered this, is that this Sam guy, Berkowitz's neighbor, had two sons, and these sons, it seems to be testimony and evidence indicating that these sons were not only good friends of Berkowitz, but that they were involved in this underground group in the 70s, and that they might have been committing these murders as well. And there are references in the Son of Sam letters to the Sons of Sam. And at one point, there's a reference to Wheaties. And apparently, one of these sons of Sam, his nickname was Wheaties. His name was John Wheat Carr, and his nickname was Wheaties. That's what he was sort of known by everyone. And also in the letter, there are references to Father Sam. Father Sam beats us. He puts us in the closet and all this. So what this investigator, journalist Maury Terry, found was that there were all of these connections between Berkowitz and actual sons of Sam who wrote things in these letters that seemed to correspond very closely with their lives. And so it seemed to be at least an interesting theory, and the police were totally uninterested in pursuing it because for them it was case closed. The public had been on the police's back for months to solve this murder, and so they were getting a ton of heat. And so what happened is when they found Berkowitz, they wanted a case closed because it's a much neater package for them than to say, oh, well, there are still people out there, we need to keep investigating. No, they just wanted it shut. And so the police were completely resistant to looking into this. Eventually, Maury Terry did find a prosecutor who was willing to look into it, reopen the case, and it basically was inconclusive. But then what Maury Terry discovered is that Berkowitz and these sons of Sam also had links to a satanic group in North Dakota that was linked to a murder of a Stanford student from North Dakota who was murdered in the Stanford chapel. A candle was inserted in her genitals, and it was like very sort of theatrical, almost satanic looking.
Right.
And so people will have to look into it themselves, look at the Netflix documentary. But basically, there seems that there are many indications that Berkowitz did not act alone, and that at the time, there actually was a network of people who were into this weird satanic alternative lifestyle stuff, and it might have gotten a little out of control.
Whoa.
Now, I understand that there are a lot of people who find a narrative like this ridiculous because they'll say, oh, satanic panic. Look, it's just more of the satanic panic. Right. And oh, yeah, it's like in the 80s when people thought that people, were worshiping Satan at daycare centers and molesting kids, and it's all bullshit. But this is what I want to say, and the documentary goes into this, is that actually in the 70s, there was a great deal of public interest and celebrity interest in Satanism. It was considered cool in the 70s. It was counterculture coming off of the 60s. Even like the Rolling Stones and some of these bands had satanic imagery, in their
Sympathy for
stuff.
the devil. Yeah.
And so people were really interested in the 70s. And there were some people who were really interested in this sort of alternative lifestyle built around Satanism and the dark side and the occult. And I don't think that it's too crazy to believe that it might have gotten a little out of hand at some points for some of the people and the individuals in these groups. And let me just add that these two brothers that I'm talking about who might have been involved in this cult, within 2 years of Berkowitz's arrest, they both died in weird circumstances. One of them committed suicide, but there were extenuating circumstances to that made the local police skeptical about it. And then the other had a fatal accident, a single car accident, where it looks like he was probably run off the road or just smashed into something. But it's like both of these brothers, within 2 years, they die. Now, later on, this journalist, Maury Terry, would actually land an interview with David Berkowitz, and Berkowitz would admit in this interview that there were other people involved. And so, and you can see in the interview, Berkowitz is uncomfortable talking about it. He doesn't really want to, but Berkowitz in that interview said that, yes, I did not act alone. There were other people involved. He corroborated a number of Maury's assertions. And so I think at the very least, who really cares now? It was a long time ago, but I think at the very least, it's an interesting story about a case where it might not be quite as open and shut as history and the police would have us believe. And so there's still a lot of people who believe that there was a network involved.
Well, we've had the great BX on this show, and she investigates satanic cults that are happening right now.
Oh, really?
She's got insane stories that, they operate, a lot of them operate online. I want to say also there's satanic cults, but it also might be that they are accelerationists posing as satanic cults to accelerate, the demise of culture. But they promote crazy violence and self-harm, pet mutilation. And there have been some in the army who've been caught, and they're, just people in different blogs and chat rooms around the world doing these crazy things. And then I also want to say, for those who don't know, New York City in the 70s, during the Summer of Sam, it was an insane place. It was a bankrupt city. My grandfather was a cop there during Summer of Sam. So, all that's going on. There was a heightened paranoia in the city. On my dad's side, all the Irish family members were firefighters, and the city was literally on fire all the time. So you have the city always burning. It's literally bankrupt. You have this supposed son of Sam running around. But, on top of all that, there is just insane, ghastly murder happening. I actually have a newspaper clipping of my grandfather arresting the man they called Mad Dog, who, and forgive me for those listening, this is a horrible thing, but this is what happened. That same summer, this guy, Mad Dog, stabbed this young girl like 200 times and left her body in this courtyard. And I have the clipping of my grandfather leading him out to the cop car. And on the other side is Summer of Sam. They still haven't caught him yet. So maybe it could be that the police are just wanting to button up the evil and be like, it's just this one guy and we can move on from now. Well, clearly, in the picture I just painted, it's more than just that. But then looking at the Berkowitz thing in particular, it's interesting that it might not just be him, and I wonder if it was just the police being like, we got to just have a guy and say that's it and quell this unrest, this paranoia, or if they knew something else and they're trying to, let other people operate. Because I do think, that's why I brought up BX. There is a satanic issue going on and has been going on well before the 70s. This is a long thing that's been going on. And they could be in the office. I'm just speculating right now. They could be in places of power. They could be cops, trying to keep people safe, who are in power. And coming from New York, we've had judges up there who've been arrested in the past 5 years for selling children into slavery in upstate New York. So there's all types of very strange things. It's not just a New York thing. And then on top of all that, there was also, maybe this was in the documentary you watched, there was a garden that these people would meet at, some type of cult in New York that they say Berkowitz might have been a part of, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's and I'm blanking on the name, but yes,
I know,
near
me too.
his house and near these the Sons of Sam's home, there was this garden, and apparently there was an abandoned pump house underneath it, and this is where people would meet. And I just want people to understand too, like, apart from Maury Terry's allegations, there had been reports in the news and police investigations of disturbing stuff going on in and around this park. And they had found, and this, you can go back and you can look at news clippings here, they had found bodies of like 100 dogs, German shepherds in particular, that had appeared to have been slain. And there were reports of people in hoods and robes meeting at this place regularly by candlelight.
Yes.
And I understand, again, this sounds like something of a fanciful imagination, but human beings, there are a variety of human beings in this world, and people are into all kinds of shit. And again, in the 70s, this was chic. It was interesting. It was something that even celebrities were getting into, the occult. And it was much more, the 70s, as you know, were much more of a sort of alternative lifestyle era for our society and our country. And so I just don't think that it's crazy to imagine that you would have some people who would get a little too far into this. And then, like you said, you would have an accelerationist that would then take it to the next level. And in fact, that's what Maury Terry has basically described, and Berkowitz has basically described. And something else that's very strange about the Berkowitz killings is that you had numerous eyewitnesses to these killings, and they would describe to the composite sketchers, they would describe vastly different appearances to these guys. And so if you look at these composite sketches that were done after each crime, sometimes they're tall, sometimes they're short, sometimes they have curly hair, sometimes it's straight. And so it's like, it's really hard to believe that all of these disparate images could be this Berkowitz guy. In fact, when you look at pictures of, for instance, the Carr brothers, you find that they correspond very well to some of these sketches that were done after the crime. So again, I understand a lot of this is circumstantial, and no one is claiming at this point, this many years later, I think that the police need to reopen the investigation again. But it is a really interesting, I think, idea that these murders might have been the result of more than one person.
Also, and I know you know about this is post Manson, right? So, and not too far after Charles Manson, too long after Charles Manson.
Zodiac Killer.
And Zodiac. So, the Manson thing, they wanted a guy. They needed a face, right? Here
comes the mind control.
And, I'm just saying, there was a dog sending psychic messages, but I am just saying, the authorities and the media love to have just one boogeyman. When, if you look into the Charles, we both love the book Chaos by Tom O'Neill. It's so much more complex than just one boogeyman. There's a lot of boogeymen.
Well, and also like the Long Island serial killer.
Like the Long Island serial killer, I'm still skeptical just being that one guy. I don't know. It remains to be seen clearly. When it comes to Berkowitz, do you buy the born again narrative that he's got now?
I do, actually. One thing that he has been very consistent in over the decades since his incarceration is that he takes full responsibility for this. And in fact, he's been uncomfortable with confirming Maury Terry's theories because he says, look, I did kill some people. I am culpable. I should be here. He's not trying to get out of prison. He has apparently been a model prisoner himself for years and years. And again, he's remained very consistent and I would say cheerful about his Christian faith. So I think that this is someone who has been spiritually, however you want to put it, redeemed during his incarceration, and good for him.
That's good. Yeah, it was hard for me to really tell. It's hard to tell because when you read or when you watch the Bundy videos, and right before
Yeah, I
he was
don't think that
executed.
guy.
He's claiming to
I
be
don't
born
think he
again
was
as
a
well.
fiend.
But that guy is, he was such a mad genius, like an evil genius. It was anytime he opened his mouth, I'm like, this guy's just, he's so charming and also great at lying. But I got a different vibe from Berkowitz when I saw Francis talk to him in prison, which is a great interview for those who haven't seen it. So before we get, you and I talked about like synchronicities and stuff before we went live, and I want to get into those. But this is a question that is an intersection of pop culture and Satanism. Is Taylor Swift the daughter of Anton LaVey? Or how does this work? What's that theory?
I haven't heard that
Oh,
theory.
you haven't heard
Is
that
what's
one?
going around?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, maybe it's the granddaughter. Do you remember? Did we hear someone told us that? If you look it up, it's on Google, so it must be true. I'm pretty sure.
I don't know. At this point, I'm just hoping that society finally gets sick of her. I'm just tired of hearing about her, not from you, but just in general.
Oh yeah, no, me too. I'm sick of hearing her too. I think she's terrible. Nothing I like about her. Are you a fan? Are you a Swiftie?
I'm not a Swift. Chris is a Swiftie. I'm not. I mean, but I don't mind her.
I don't mind her either. I'm just annoyed with hearing. I'm annoyed with the coupledom too. I just think he's a big oaf. I'm sorry. Yeah. And so I find nothing about him intriguing. I find nothing about her intriguing. I'm completely unintrigued.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. They're very boring to me. Nothing fun about them. And manufactured. But so what were you saying about, we were talking about stories and strange stories and that you've experienced some type of synchronicities in your life. What were those about?
Yeah, so you'd asked me about alien experiences or ghosts or things like that or supernatural. And so I can't claim to have any of like those kinds of traditional experiences, but I do believe in a spiritual reality. I do believe in some kind of afterlife or next life. I have very nebulous spiritual beliefs. I was raised a Christian, became a born again Christian early in life, drifted away from that in a very stereotypical sense in my 20s. Mm-hmm. And now I'm at a place where I don't really know what I believe. And I still have, I would describe it, a significant crisis of faith in the meaning of life and the justification for the sufferings we go through. But all of that having been said, mm-hmm. foundationally, I do believe in God, a spiritual realm. Mm-hmm. And so I have seen in my life at times, and I think other people can identify with this, what Jung called synchronicities. And these are times when coincidences happen to you, seeming coincidences that are meaningful or that could be read as meaningful if you would accept them as such. And so I have a couple of instances. I guess I'll tell you this one story because to me it seems so coincidental as to be unlikely. So when I was in my 20s, the guy that I was dating, that I'd been dating for 4 years, was almost like a fiance to me. We weren't engaged, but almost like a fiance. He got cancer, lung cancer, by the way, from smoking. So you'll put your tobacco down. But he got cancer and he died. And, you know, in your 20s, it's traumatic at any age, but in your 20s, you're not really expecting to deal with that, right? It was very hard. And it was hard to watch him go through that process. I was his primary caregiver. And it's terrible when someone gets a terminal illness and they deteriorate and they die. And so I came out of that. I had gone into that situation more or less an agnostic at that point anyway. And I came out of it pretty much with a similar view, except I was really struggling at that point, yearning for some kind of indication that God existed, because I just couldn't handle, like many people, couldn't handle the idea that death was just it and that everything we're doing here is utter pointlessness and nothing continues on, right? Yeah. And so yet, though, because I was not a Christian and I didn't trust any kind of organized faith or religion, I felt like there was no one that I could turn to. And so this might seem kind of strange to people, but I started reading about near-death experiences because that was the only thing that I could handle reading about. I didn't want to read the Bible or, the Quran or whatever. Like I just wanted to read stories about people who say there's an afterlife, basically, right? Yeah. I was clinically brain dead. I got outside my body. I saw the light, these kinds of things, right? And so I started reading these, not like obsessively or anything, but here and there. And I was going through this crisis of faith and this struggle. And I remember that I got to a point where I prayed this prayer to God. And it seems like such a weird prayer to pray, but I'll explain it in a moment. I said, God, I need an indication that you are real, that there is some kind of afterlife, that there's a purpose to all this. I need a sign. And this is the sign that I chose. And it sounds so random, but I'll explain it in a minute. I said, I need you to send someone into my life who is a recognized expert in near-death experiences. That was what I asked for. And the reason I asked for it was not because I wanted to talk to someone about near-death experiences. I'd read about them, but because that was at that point, that was the only connection that I felt like I could safely have to the spiritual, because I didn't want to go to church. I didn't want to get an organized religion. This was like the only thing I had at that moment, right? That I was sort of clinging on to. And so that was the thing I chose. Kind of strangely, I said, this will be the sign, that there's something more. If you send someone who is and I said this, a recognized,
wow,
I think I even said credentialed expert.
You really got
weird
specific
thing to put out there, right?
Yeah, I love it.
So anyway, and so I put that out there very sort of intentionally, but also at the same time thinking there's no way in hell this is going to happen. Have you ever done that? Like you pray something or you put something out there and you think, but of course this isn't going to happen.
Oh yeah. I'll tell you a story after this.
Very intentional.
Yep.
Well, so several weeks later, I was hanging out with a friend of mine, and I was pretty deep into some drug dependency days, and I've had struggles on and off with that throughout my life. But I was very deep at this point to drug dependency, and so I was hanging out with one of my fellow druggie friends, and I was asking her if she could get me a connection for something I was looking for, and she was like, "Oh yeah," she was like, "My buddy, I'll have him come over because he has a prescription for this or whatever, right?" And so this guy comes over. And this guy, by the way, is dead now. He got stabbed to death in a heroin deal gone bad.
Geez.
So anyway,
wow.
But he came over and he became a good friend of mine for a while. But anyway, he came over this first meeting, and I was trying to get some pills. And so we did this transaction, and then we started hanging out, and we got along. I liked him. It wasn't like a romantic thing. He was gay, actually, but we had kind of a rapport. And so we hung out that night, the three of us. And toward the end of the night, we'd been having different conversations about different things. And he said, my dad is coming into town. I'm going to start crying saying this. My dad is coming into town next week. And I think you're so smart and you're an academic. Because at that point I was in grad school. I was getting my PhD. He said, you're so smart. You're an academic. He is too. You should go out with this. I think you'll really hit it off. And it's funny because I'm just talking to this like druggy guy here, right? But he was saying, "You need to meet my dad. He's really smart." So I said, "Yeah, I'd love to." And I said, "What does he study?" And I said, "What does he do?" And he's like, "Oh, well, he's a professor at UVA, University of Virginia." And I said, "What does he study?" And he said he studies near-death experiences.
Dude, you just gave me chills.
And
wow.
It turns out that this guy, his name is Ed Kelly. You can look him up. He works at the Division of Perceptual Studies at UVA, which, by the way, is basically the only academic institution that has a department devoted to paranormal activity and near-death experiences and things of this nature. And I'm not saying that I believe like ghosts and all that, right? There's a range of paranormal activity. Some of it, I think, legit, some of it not.
For sure.
But one of the main things that they study in a very methodical, scientific way is near-death experiences. And in fact, he is one of the top 5 experts in the world on near-death experiences.
Wow. That is unbelievable.
Some people would write that off as a coincidence, but I just can't, dude.
Nah, dude. I don't either. I think that's
come into your life.
That's too remarkable. It's just too remarkable. When things like that happen, and I started experiencing certain synchronicities like that, you can't just write it off as coincidence. I think your message was answered.
It was. And and this is what I want to say to people too about spirituality is you have these moments in your life of synchronicity and these moments of affirmation, and it doesn't necessarily make the road easy, because I'm still, quite frankly, in a crisis of faith. And I've had some things happen recently in my life that have really made me just feel devastated about the suffering in this world and what I see as the meaninglessness of it. But I tell you, Shane, stuff like that, stuff like what happened to me back there with that synchronicity, that is what sustains me. And that is what keeps me thinking, don't give up. Come on. You got that message back there. You've gotten messages before.
Yep.
Just keep, even if you don't understand it, even if you fucking hate God sometimes.
Yep.
Like I'll say that sometimes. I'll be like, I fucking hate you. Sorry. Can I be cursing?
Yeah. It's totally fine. Yeah.
I'll say that. Sometimes that is the only form of prayer that I can muster, is to tell God I hate him. But you know what? Underneath all of that, I'm still there with him.
Right.
I'm still there.
Yep. I mean, there's people in the Bible who who really don't like God because he's punishing them, but they still hold it together and find love in the end. And it's all a test. You reminded me of one of the major synchronicities I've experienced. I don't know if I shared this on the show, but it's like so I was atheist forever, just militantly atheist. And then I married a Christian, so that was weird. And then I started to like really I wanted to try to pray. And I was like, every time our son was in the NICU, this is 8 years ago, and I tried praying. I actually walked around New York City while he was in the NICU, going to different churches and just sitting there and trying to pray and talking to different priests and all this stuff, Greek Orthodox and all types of people. And it just felt like a fraud. I remember even trying to pray and it just not working. Didn't feel right. And then that continued for a while, for years, and just not connecting. And telling everyone, like, I just want to learn, like, how do you pray? Like, how does it, I know it seems so easy, but I'm like, how do you do it? How do I say it? It just seems silly. And then I even did this show during lockdowns with a buddy of mine who was like, what was he, Pentecost? So he was like super religious. And then there was me, and we would talk for like a year or two about a lot of things, life in general, but always come back to like praying. And so this is like a theme of my life. How do you pray? What is prayer? And then, this is a weird segue. And then Kanye West comes into my life randomly, right? And that whole thing happens. And I am in LA with him. And what does he have me do for 2 months after that? He's making me write prayers.
Wow.
So like me and him talk about what he's wondering what prayer was. And so that weekend in LA, we go to church, we're talking about prayer. In my head, I'm like, that's hilarious that this guy I've like talked about for so long is now asking me about prayer. I've been thinking about prayer. And then when I go home, he keeps hitting me up. He's like, we just got to learn to pray. And I didn't tell him any of this. He's like, I just got to learn to pray. On his own,
you got to learn to pray?
Yeah. And he's like, every day I'm literally writing prayers for him. Wow. And we're like, wow. Like we're like in a creative writing workshop for prayers, and he's like, we should say this and that. So I'm just like, oh, that's hilarious. Oh, on top of all of that, before everything happened with Kanye, I did the same thing you did. I talked to God. I said, just send me a sign on how to, I literally said, how do you pray?
On how to pray?
Literally. And I asked him, I didn't ask for a credentialed, I didn't get that specific. I should have, well, it worked out. But I swear to you, that next day is when I got the text from Tim Pool saying you should come through. And I knew it was going to be about meeting Kanye. Didn't know anything was going to happen like that. And it didn't, this whole story, the way I'm telling it to you, it didn't really dawn on me in that epic of a way till later, where I'm like, oh, wow, all these years and me even asking, it just was like, oh, that's hilarious. I can't write that off. It's another one of those things where it's like, that's so remarkable, so crazy personal to the thing I was going through for years. I'm not writing it off as just a mere coincidence. It's too beautiful, And
I understand that there are people who would say, well, and I totally get this. What a stupid way for God to communicate to people. Why doesn't he just speak? Mm-hmm. Isn't that the most logical thing? If he wants to be heard, then he speaks. And I totally get that. I feel that at times. And I can't explain why this more circuitous, mystical, subtle way of communication is the one that people tend to experience. But there's so much that I can't explain. And really, as much as I, in many ways, hate this world and don't understand this hellscape that we are in. And I know there are beautiful things too, but I'm depressive. I see it mostly as a hellscape. But even though I feel all that, I don't understand it. I'm very often angry at God. At the same time, I basically still come down to the idea of the Pascalian wager, that what each of us faces in life, among other things, is a choice to bet on meaning or to bet on no meaning. And those who bet on no meaning, or you live your life according to that, I totally get it. I'm there with you many days, and I get it. But at the same time, overall in my life, I'm trying to bet on meaning because I don't see the advantage in going the other way.
That's great. I totally agree with you. I get it because it is a hellscape. I think it's been a hellscape for a very long time. And we just inherited this hellscape, and it's going to continue being a hellscape. But there's also huge pockets of beauty. And I also
That's
think
true.
that God's voice could be the events themselves too. Like maybe just the perception of hearing a voice isn't the right interpretation. You know, I think also it's like that the language is the thing happening sometimes, and it's just too profound, you know, to think of as like a word or a voice. But yeah, I choose to bet on meaning. That's a great way of putting it. Totally. Well, I think we should bet on meeting is the greatest way to end that.
Now that everyone's
this conversation
crying.
so much.
Yeah,
Thank you for having me on,
this is
and I'd love
amazing.
to have you on again. You know,
Yeah.
I know when I've had you on in the past, we've just talked Marilyn Manson, but I
Yeah.
think we see here there's a lot more we can do. So.
Oh yeah, we'll definitely do that again, and we're gonna have more Marilyn Manson stuff to talk about soon, considering what's happening in about
Absolutely.
20 days from now. So that's cool. Where can everyone find you on the internet?
Yes, so I do go by the difficult to spell moniker Colonel Kurtz. It's an Apocalypse Now reference for those of you who are a little older in the audience or war movie fans.
Yep.
But if you if you type in I'm on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and then YouTube, and it's Colonel Kurtz 99. So if you go to any of those and you search for Colonel Kurtz 99, or if that's too hard, just search for Kurtz Manson, because I've done so much Marilyn Manson stuff that now I'm associated in a Google
awesome.
search with him. So if you just put in Kurtz, Kurtz, and then Manson, then I'll come up too.
Yeah, everyone should definitely check you
And
out.
I've got more. I just want to say
Yeah.
I've got a new video that I just put out on the
sweet.
Menendez brothers. Basically, I tried to put together a 15-minute summary, a collection of different interview snippets,
Cool.
testimony, scenes, what have you, putting together what I think are the best pieces of evidence and testimony on their
Awesome.
behalf or for their side.
awesome.
So
Can I
if
ask-
people want to learn more, see a little summary, they can go to one of my pages and see it.
Awesome.
I'm just curious what you got your PhD in.
English literature and film. So I went to UNC, North Carolina, had a great experience. I've talked before about my issues with academia. Went on Tim Pool, and I definitely think it's got a lot of problems. And I've talked about that on my channel a lot too. But I did learn a lot from being in an environment where I was encouraged to and had to read a lot. And so it was overall for me, it was a really good experience despite my critiques of academia. But UNC, North Carolina, Chapel Hill, beautiful area. Go
it
Tar
is.
Heels. And yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. You're the best. This was a great talk. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Likewise.
See
See you
ya.
later.
Bye.
Bye.
Man, that was awesome.
That was great. She's very well spoken.
Yeah, she's great. So everyone should definitely check out her stuff online. Check her out. She talks about a lot of really interesting stuff. And the Marilyn Manson story is, something that's interesting to me because it's just it's another
What's happening
version
in
of
20
like,
days?
oh, his new album.
Oh.
Yeah, his new album. That was like cryptic.
Yeah. It's like
but it's not
inside
that
joke,
cryptic. It's not that
inside joke.
cryptic. No. He's got a new album coming out. But he's gone through a lot of interesting stuff and also been made into a caricature on the internet and in media in general,
Yeah.
for the last 20 something years. So he's got a lot to say, I think, in these new songs, and I'm excited to hear him. So, man. So, if you guys got stories, hit us up. We don't have a caller today, but we will have one for our next show, and because we're pre-recording this one. But you can hit me up with your stories at Shane Cashman at scanner.com, scnr.com, and we'll bring you on through Discord. And thank you guys for tuning in. We'll see you next time.